Over the past year, which was totally compromised by COVID-19, the worst pandemic since the Spanish flu, several industrial events happened. The stock market crashed, unemployment rates reached record high levels, and it seemed like every business you could think of was on the verge of bankruptcy. And if these events were not bad enough, silently, out of the spotlight, something else was happening. Something that we haven't experienced over the centuries. An event that could easily change the texture of our entire civilization, like we've never experienced it before. In the early 1700s, the Kingdom of France had the densest population and richest economy on the entire European continent. And over the next 70 years, life has prospered. Economy constantly expanded. New education policies have been developed that have made literacy in the kingdom increase dramatically. Life expectancy has increased, while the death rate decreased. Trade with the kingdoms of Spain and Italy increased by 900%, which led to a revolution in the industrialization of the country. Apparently, all these achievements seemed great, but in reality, 1/3 of the population of France has endured poverty, and to make the situation much worse, the entire middle class was struggling by the year 1770. And those two problems, mixed with an accumulation of sovereign debt and oppressive fiscal policies, led to a new doctrine. In those times, France had three social classes. You had the clergy, the nobles, and then everyone else who were largely composed of the middle class and the peasants. In fact, 98% of the entire population was in the third class, yet nearly all of the benefits of the current economy went to the nobles and the clergy. For example, the nobles and the clergy only composed about 2% of the population. Also, the nobles and clergy did not have to pay any taxes at all, despite them being very wealthy. Several years of poor harvest from their farmland led to many people in France going hungry. But the nobles, the king and the clergy all seemed to be well fed and were able to pay higher prices and outbid the peasants for food. That, along with the king's inability to collect ample amounts of taxes and overprinting of the French currency, forced King Louis XVI to call upon all three classes of citizens to get together and figure out a solution to this economic crisis. The third class of citizens wanted for the wealthy to pay taxes and for the government to cut down on spending. The king mainly just wanted money and wanted to maintain the government spending, and the nobles and clergy wanted to not only avoid paying any taxes. And so it was after this assembly of the king and three classes that led to one of the most important moments in the history of the Western world. After the average, hungry, and poor citizens realized that the entirety of the downside of the current economic and taxation system was on them, while simultaneously seeing no upside when times were good, they decided to revolt and create their own system from scratch. Now, even the French Revolution may not have been as successful as some may think, and some may say it went too far. Others say it didn't go far enough. It is important to know this. During their economic crisis, average people were hit the hardest, and the elite of the society experienced almost no downside. The unfair taxation system, where the wealthiest paid the least amount in taxes, also created an unsettled middle class. The compilation of sovereign debt, the devaluing of the currency, the exclusion of the lower class from political positions of power, and the view of rampant inequality between rich and poor. All of these factors led to a complete transformation of society. Does any of this sound familiar to you? You see, this transformation of society in France that was really caused by inequality and lack of resources for the poor led France to ultimately losing their status as Europe's economic #1 power, while conceding that spot to the rising power of the British. Now, I'm not saying we're on the brink of a revolution by any means, but one can't help but draw parallels between the French Revolution and today. Now, over the past 13 months, we witnessed the expansion of wealth for just a few citizens on skills that we have never really seen before. All this time, while simultaneously seeing the working class people struggle and live paycheck to paycheck. So as of today, the bottom 50% of Americans, which is roughly 164 million people, have a combined net worth of $2.1 trillion. That's about $12,000 per capita. And that net worth is usually tied up in things like vehicles, checking accounts, saving accounts, and possibly some stocks or a 401k. But now, if you were to combine the 25 richest people from the United States, you would have the same amount of wealth as the bottom 164 million Americans. And this wealth is always tied up into a small percentage ownership of a very large company, like Amazon or Tesla. In fact, since the COVID pandemic started, the world's 2,700 or so billionaires have seen their net worths increase by an average of 44%. And for comparison, the average middle-class American has seen their income cut by an average of about 3% over the last 13 months. So thinking back to the French Revolution, the reason why the revolution occurred was not because of some highly sophisticated thinking. It was because of wealth and equality, and the resources of the entire economy were not going to the people at the bottom and the middle class. And at the time, the nobles, who composed just 1% of the population, owned about 35% of wealth in France. Well, as of today, 1% of the U.S. owns just under 32% of the wealth of the country. That is a dramatic increase of 28% we saw just under a decade ago. And you should also consider other similarities between the French Revolution and today, like how the extremely wealthy don't pay anywhere near the same percentage of taxes as the average person. Warren Buffett, for example, always talks about how his upper middle class secretary has a tax rate of about 36%. Meanwhile, Warren Buffett has a tax rate of about 18%, thanks to the lower capital gains tax that billionaires take advantage of. We can also look at the compilation of government debt, which sent France into crisis, and compare that to the situation that is also happening today all across the world. France also started overprinting its currency a few hundred years ago, and, well, we're doing that today as well. And another thing is that there is rising competition coming from around the world that is putting pressure on the number one economic superpower. A few centuries ago, it was British Empire, and today it's Communist China. Now, even though there are a ton of similarities between the French Revolution's economic crisis and today, I'll say that there is one or two really big differences. One of which is that during the French Revolution, a very large portion of the population was facing a life-or-death hunger and starvation crisis, meaning that a revolution, in their views, was a must in order to stay alive. Meanwhile, today in the States, starvation is a much rarer issue. Although I will say that food insecurity is still a problem, starvation itself is not really the same case. And the second key difference, in my opinion, was that France was essentially in a perpetual state of war for decades, and that in itself can do a lot of harm to an economy and a government. And today, there's not anywhere near the same amount of warfare as was going on several hundreds of years ago. So altogether, as I mentioned earlier, too much inequality is a problem that leads directly to rebellions, but the same can be said for too little inequality, and in the end, the people must decide how much is too much and how much is just too little. Please leave your comments below on what you think.
We hope you found this video valuable. Let us know what your opinion on all this is down in the comments section. And don't forget to like it. share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more content just like this.